NHL free agency is the most exciting time to be a hockey fan. It's the opportunity for your favorite organization to go out and get a star player that can completely change the future of your team. But sometimes these signings can really cripple an organization and change a lot about where they were heading based on just one simple deal. Well, today that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. Recently, I talked about some of the worst trades in NHL history, and you guys asked me to talk about some of the worst UFA signings. So today I have 7 of the worst NHL UFA deals from the past decade of the league. These are deals that have completely aged poorly for these organizations, and some of them are still even affecting these teams today. So if you guys have been liking the content lately, make sure you hit that subscribe button now, let you know whenever I post new videos like this, and let's get right into this one. Alright, so to do research for this video, I was scouring a ton of forums, and one of the trades that stood out on almost every single one was with the Vancouver Canucks, and I'm sure a lot of you guys know about this deal at this point. Back in 2013, Loui Eriksson was traded to the Boston Bruins in a 7-player trade that sent Tyler Seguin to the Dallas Stars. Loui Eriksson was a very respectable player in Dallas. He had 3 seasons amounting 70 points in 2009, 2010, and 2011. And when arriving with Boston, it wasn't exactly like he was a terrible fit for that team. Loui Eriksson's tenure in Boston was pretty mixed, I would say. In his first year, he had 37 points and continued to grow from there. And in his final season with Boston, he reached 63 points in a year where he would then be a free agent. Boston then realized that this was probably the peak for Loui Eriksson with the Bruins and decided to let him walk in free agency, realizing that signing him to a deal could be pretty costly for the organization. Well, in comes the Vancouver Canucks, who would then steal Loui Eriksson from the Bruins, but in a very bad way. The Canucks would sign Loui Eriksson to a 6-year, $36 million contract that may go down as one of the worst in the franchise's history. Loui Eriksson would go on to score no more than 29 points at best with the Canucks in 2018 and completely fizzled off, eventually being moved to the Arizona Coyotes, where he played his final season, scoring only 19 points in 73 games played. This is easily one of the worst contracts in Vancouver Canucks history, if not of recent memory. Loui Eriksson never reached the potential he had in Boston and never even came close to the player that he was in Dallas, and I'm sure that Vancouver Canucks fans are still sour about this one to this day. This next one I would be remiss to not talk about, considering how recent it was and how impactful it's been on this one team. Now, I'm sure all of you guys have heard about this contract at this point. Jack Campbell, after the 2021-22 season with the Toronto Maple Leafs, signed a new contract with the Edmonton Oilers on a 5-year deal worth $25 million. And we all know how this story goes. Jack Campbell enters his first year with the Edmonton Oilers and averages an .888 save percentage over around 40 games. He's then splitting time with Stuart Skinner, and the team decides to run it back in 2023-24, where Campbell only plays in 5 games before the team realizes that he's not going to be the answer for them, averaging around an .870 save percentage and being moved to their minor league team, never to be recalled up again in that season. Campbell was then bought out after their long playoff run and signed a 1-year deal with the Detroit Red Wings worth $750,000 in a prove-it-year deal. This is unfortunate for the Edmonton Oilers because Campbell was supposed to be the answer for arguably the worst roster hole that this team had, and unfortunately his tenure was a complete disaster. Where it was supposed to be the answer for the prime years of Connor McDavid, the Edmonton Oilers are now going to pay big time, having to take money off their cap and lose potential roster pieces because they made a poor decision on a pretty dicey UFA who a lot of people weren't too sure about. Next up, you guys can call me crazy, but I feel like this one contract is already starting to age poorly, and it's not the worst deal in the world, but I do feel like this team is going to regret it in about a year or two. Johnny Gaudreau, after having his best season with the Calgary Flames with 115 points, decided to sign a new contract with the Columbus Blue Jackets. Johnny Gaudreau is making a 7-year, $68 million contract with Columbus, and let's just say his first couple of seasons have been a bit underwhelming. Now, it's not to say that Johnny Gaudreau hasn't been a good player. In his first year, he had over 70 points, and this year he had 60 points. But when you consider the player that the Columbus Blue Jackets thought they were getting, that 100-point Johnny Gaudreau, you have to kind of look back at this deal and say, what was Columbus thinking? Now, Columbus was hoping to get themselves back into the playoff picture, bringing in Patrik Laine and then, of course, Johnny Gaudreau, but both of these contracts have proved to be very poor for Columbus, as they are now back at the bottom of the league, trying to rebuild yet again and get themselves back in contention. Johnny Gaudreau is still a solid player, but I do think that this contract is a bit of an overpay based on his production, and I feel like the fit between him and Columbus Columbus is just not going to age well, and that the two are going to grow sour before this eventually works out. I think that if Columbus is smart, they're going to try to find a way to move on from him, but I just don't think that this contract is going to be friendly for any team in the league unless they're willing to give up draft compensation with it. Now, Johnny Gaudreau could turn things around and Columbus could really benefit from this deal, but at this point, with Gaudreau aging and Columbus being nowhere near a playoff spot, I feel like this could be looked back on as one of the worst deals, and I personally am already feeling sour about this one. Next up, back in 2016-17, the Boston Bruins made a very questionable decision signing a 35-year-old forward to a 5-year, $30 million contract. Back in that 2016 year, David Backes was pretty much a star with the St. Louis Blues, averaging around 50 points at best with the team. Then he comes to Boston, and this team signs him to an arguably Stanley Cup ready roster, and it just blew up in their face. Like I mentioned earlier, his best season with the Blues was 62 points back in 2010, which at the time was pretty high considering Hart Trophy winners were winning with around 80 plus points. But if you take a look at his time in Boston, his best season was the first year of the contract, where he had 38 points in 74 games, and eventually he trickled off, only having 20 points in his real final season with the Bruins before being traded to the Anaheim Ducks. It's unfortunate how this worked out, because at the time it wasn't like the worst signing because David Backes was such a fun player to watch, but today, just looking back on it, this is such a stupid move made by the Bruins. You would never sign a 35-year-old veteran who's clearly going to decline in the next coming years to an arguably prime contract, top 6 money contract, where at his best, like I said, he was a 60-point player. I think unfortunately for the Bruins, they really had to deal with this mess for years, and this may have even hindered them in their Stanley Cup run back in 2019, and I'm sure every Boston Bruins fan is looking at Don Sweeney thinking, what were you doing that year? This one made no sense for the organization. This next one, it's definitely a little bit over a decade, but I feel like it might be one of the most significant free agent signings that I can remember as a hockey fan. So let me explain. Back in 2012, the Minnesota Wild were pretty much stuck in the middle of the NHL. Sure, they were a playoff team, but I don't think anybody ever seriously considered them to be a Stanley Cup contender. They had some nice players, but they didn't have that top of the league talent that you need in order to push through that threshold. So the Minnesota Wild decided to double down on some of their high draft picks, signing both Zach Parise and Ryan Suter to a 13-year, $98 million contract extension that we all consider to be mega deals today. Now, these mega deals are not allowed to happen anymore. The NHL prohibits teams from locking down players for this long of an extension, and for whatever reason, I think it's probably for the best. Both Parise and Suter were the crown jewels of the free agency market in 2012, and there was a lot of speculation as to whether or not they were going to sign with the Minnesota Wild or move on to another team that maybe was considered to be more of a serious contender. And then eventually they signed these deals, which left the entire hockey world split on whether or not the Minnesota Wild made the right decision. Now, looking back, I think we all can agree that this was a terrible move made by the Wild. They're still paying both of these buyout contracts to this day, and it's really prohibited them from really pushing through that threshold and becoming a top contender in the NHL. Sure, the Minnesota Wild have some nice pieces today, like Joel Eriksson and of course Kirill Kaprizov, but unfortunately they're kind of just stuck in this middle of the pack position because these contracts are still preventing them from signing big time players, and unfortunately these deals have aged so poorly that every Minnesota fan is going to regret this for the rest of their lives. And the last UFA signing on my list, this one's a bit polarizing because it didn't really cripple the organization, but it was definitely one of the worst free agent signings that I have seen in a while, considering the drop-off that this player had. Now, James Neal, a lot of you guys might remember him from his time with Pittsburgh, where he was tearing it up with guys like Crosby and Malkin. But did you know that he eventually signed a deal with the Calgary Flames that was easily one of the worst in the franchise's history? Well, back in 2018, James Neal signed a 5-year, $28.75 million contract and was expected to be a key contributor for the Flames. However, his scoring touch in Calgary completely vanished when you compare it to his time with Pittsburgh. James Neal was only able to net 7 goals and 12 assists for 19 points in 63 games during his one and only season with the Calgary Flames. To make the matters even worse for Calgary, he again found his offensive game while playing with the Oilers, scoring 19 goals and 31 points in 55 games with his new team, so it basically basically just proved that he was a terrible fit for Calgary and that they made a terrible decision signing him to that deal. Now, like I said, this wasn't the worst contract because they were able to dish it off before they had to either buy it out or just kind of sit with the amount of money that they were paying Neal. And again, he found his offensive touch, so his game wasn't completely destroyed and he was able to play a little bit longer. But imagine what could have happened with Calgary if they weren't able to find a trade partner. They signed a guy who was supposed to add some top 6 contributions and he just completely fell off, proving that maybe Calgary isn't the best fit for a lot of players, and you have to sort of be mentally tough, because I feel like this continues to happen with Calgary and we're seeing it again today with guys like Gaudreau and Huberdeau as well. But these are some of the worst signings from the past NHL decade of NHL free agency. Let me know what you guys think about these deals. Do you think that they were all terrible? Do you think that some of them weren't so bad in hindsight? Let me know what you guys think about all of this in the comments below, and let me know if you want a part 2 to this as well. Make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel as always. I'll see you guys in the next one.